Hello and welcome to a CIEEM webinar on district level licensing for Great Crested Newts, habitat delivery for the Natural England-led scheme. This webinar will be presented by Annabelle Phillips and Craig Thomas from Natural England, and I will shortly be handing over to them. Before I do, I'd just like to talk about some upcoming events that CIEEM have. So we've got our Autumn Conference, which is on planning for success, maximising biodiversity through planning and strategic land use management. And that will be taking place on the 19th and 20th of November. And tickets are available on the training and events area of our website. We also have a couple of other webinars that you might be interested in. So we have a webinar on amphibian entrapment in drains, a new approach to mitigation, which is taking place on Thursday, the 7th of November. And again, tickets are available on our website. And we also have the last of the series of the district level licensing webinars and this one will be on how to apply, and which will be on Tuesday, the 26th of November. And again, tickets can be purchased on our website. So before I hand over to Annabelle and Craig, I'd just like to mention that there will be a Q&A session. This will be taking place at the end of the webinar, but please do feel free to send your questions in throughout. The way to do this is by clicking on the Q&A button, which is at the top of the screen, typing in your answer and then pressing send. And again, we'll do this session at the end. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Annabelle and Craig. Thank you.
Okay, hi all. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you can all see the presentation in front of you. My name's Annabelle Phillips, and I'm being joined by my colleague Craig Thomas to discuss habitat delivery under the Natural England-led district level licensing schemes today. This is the fourth of a series of webinars we've been doing recently on district level licensing. The first covered an introduction to district level licensing. We had a couple that followed that on the evidence base around data collection and eDNA surveys, and also the species distribution modelling, which underpins the whole approach. We do have another webinar, as Christy mentioned earlier, coming up in a couple of weeks on how to apply to enter the scheme if you'd be interested in doing so. And I think the webinars that have been run already are available on CIEEM's YouTube area. So I'll just start off with a couple of introductory slides. Those of you who've been in attendance on the other webinars may have seen these already, but just wanted to provide a bit of context around what district licensing is to help set up the section on habitat delivery. So Great Crested Newts are distributed widely across Northern Europe. However, their populations are declining across their range, and that includes within the UK, although the UK does remain quite a stronghold for the species. The declines are primarily as a result of habitat loss. It's estimated that there's been an approximately 75% decline in ponds since around the 1900s in the UK. And obviously they rely on ponds for breeding habitat, so yeah, it's been a fairly severe decline. As a result of their decreasing populations, they are a species which is protected under legislation, and it is illegal to capture, kill, injure or disturb a great crested newt or to damage their habitat without a licence. Where this species is found on development sites, the widely used approach is centred around mitigation, which generally involves site-by-site survey, exclusion fencing, trapping, translocation to move animals out of the development footprint, and habitat created on site. And it's estimated that the amount of money spent on the surveys, the fencing, and the trapping and the translocation outstrips that spent on habitat creation by approximately 7 to 1. So while these resources are concentrated on individual sites to prevent losses, and mitigation really looks to achieve no net loss overall, at the landscape scale, the populations are continuing to decline. So district level licensing is a new approach, and it's looking at doing things a bit differently. So rather than focusing on individual sites and achieving no net loss at the site scale, it's looking to maximise gains for newts at the strategic landscape scale. So we're looking under the approach to deliver high numbers of good quality ponds in areas of good quality terrestrial habitat to help improve connectivity for the species and the available habitat resource. And these ponds will be in strategic locations in order to maximise benefits for the species, and their management will be secured and they'll be monitored in the long term for a minimum of 25 years. And this all really fits in with the principles outlined within the Lawton review of more, bigger, better, and more joined up. So a little bit around habitat delivery under the Natural England-led schemes now. So what are we doing, and how does it all work? So as we've discussed, district licensing compensates for impacts to great crested newts as a result of development. So we're looking to achieve a compensation ratio of 4 to 1. So that's for every occupied pond lost, we're looking to achieve 4 compensation ponds and no net loss of ponds overall. So even if a pond was unoccupied by great crested newts, but the development associated with that pond wished to enter district licensing, then we would still be expecting that to achieve no net loss for those unoccupied ponds as well. Under the scheme, we consider ponds to be lost to newts even if they're not actually lost in reality. So the ponds may be retained on the site, and there's lots of really good reasons to retain ponds for other reasons other than newts. But under the way this schemes work, they're considered functionally lost to great crested newts. So even where ponds are outside development sites, we also consider impacts to those ponds based on the proportion of terrestrial habitat which is impacted. So for example, if 50% of the terrestrial habitat associated with a pond was located within a development site, but the pond was off-site, we would be expecting that also to be compensated at the 4 to 1 ratio. However, we'd consider that half a pond lost, if you like. Compensation is always provided in advance of impacts wherever possible, and ideally we'd like ponds to be in the ground for a minimum of a year to allow them to become functional, allow vegetation to establish, and hopefully an opportunity for newts to begin to colonise these compensation ponds. The compensation ponds will be monitored and managed for a minimum of 25 years, and we're also creating a contingency pond for every compensation pond which is created. These contingency ponds act as a method of minimising risk. So it is likely that over the 25-year period, some of the compensation ponds may fail for a variety of reasons. However, we will always have a bank of contingency ponds ready to replace these compensation ponds at any point. And this will ensure that the 4 to 1 ratio is maintained across the 25-year period. So these contingency ponds will be being delivered up front. And so what that actually means is from the outset, we'll be achieving an approximately 8 to 1 ratio of ponds to ponds impacted. However, this ratio will decline slightly as ponds begin to fail and as we need to use these contingency ponds to replace compensation ponds. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of background on how the scheme works. I'm going to pass over to Craig now, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're targeting habitat.
Thanks, Annabelle. So we produce strategic opportunity area maps to dictate where we are looking to create or restore ponds. And these maps are bespoke for each area that we're looking to roll out district licensing. And they're based on species distribution models. They look at the types of habitat present across a landscape area and rank them according to their suitability or otherwise for GCN. So you get positive attributes like woodland and grassland, which give a positive score, arable and urban a negative. And you assess each area, each point, with relation to the suitability of terrestrial habitat around that location. And that allows us to build up a species distribution model. It's been discussed in more detail in a previous presentation, which is available. And from that, we end up with an SOA map, which is 95% accurate, which predicts the presence or otherwise of GCN. And it's within these SOAs, these strategic opportunity areas, that we are looking to create habitat. The SOAs as well, keeping me on my toes, are in core and fringe. So we have core SOAs where habitat and ponds in particular are within 250 metres of each other. So the nearest pond would be in 250 metres. By focusing habitat within core SOAs, then we're looking at increasing existing populations. We then have fringe SOA areas, obviously on the outside of the core areas. And then by putting ponds in there, which will be 500 metres maximum from the nearest pond, we'd be looking at expanding the population. So by putting ponds in both core and fringe SOAs, we are increasing and expanding populations to allow populations to move through the landscape. Not only that, but we also have to ensure that we have on-site surveys to augment the information that we've modelled and mapped to dictate whether a particular point is suitable. Even if it might be in an SOA, we do check that there is a suitable terrestrial habitat around that particular point in order to site a compensation pond. Thank you. So that's an example of an SOA map in the southwest, and there you can see the various colours. Quite a lot of that area is SOA. Some areas are far more fragmented in their SOAs. And again, there you can see the core and the fringe. Core are the pink colours and the fringe are the bluer colours. And we'll be looking at creating a mixture of habitat, i.e. ponds, in both of those to help existing and populations, and also to allow populations to move through the landscape, connecting up, etc. Thank you. So we are looking at quick colonisation of GCN, ideally within 2 to 3 years, and obviously by putting ponds in core SOA areas. That'll be where a pond is, as I said earlier, within 250 metres. We'll expect rather rapid colonisation. But as I said previously, we will be looking at having a site visit and a check to ensure that there is good quality terrestrial habitat around a particular site. Terrestrial habitat suitable, such as woodland, rough grassland and scrub. And we would be avoiding areas where there is significant human or animal disturbance. We'd be checking about water quality issues, runoff from agricultural activity, etc. So that's done not only through the modelling, but is then done by a site visit by a habitat delivery body. Thank you, Annabelle. I have to say, I keep prompting Annabelle because she's the one with the finger on the button to move these slides through. So upon specification, clearly we've put a significant amount of work into what an ideal GCN pond looks like. This work's been undertaken by our specialist, amphibian reptile specialist within Natural England, but also extensive consultation with the likes of Cheshire Wildlife Trust and other bodies. And we also have an expert panel of various people from academia, Freshwater Habitats Trust, etc., who are fed into this pond specification. So we're looking at ponds between 100 metres square and 1,000 metres square. It's quite variable. That's because we are looking at restoring as well as creating ponds. Some of the pond restorations could be of significant size. Clearly, ideal central depth of the pond can vary between 1 metre to 3.5 metres. We're finding that, particularly in the east of England, where we might be putting ponds into a dry area, and clearly we would probably be looking to put a deeper pond as a central depth in such areas. Bank gradients vary, that 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. Quite happy for a range of depths across the pond, and looking for suitable submerged marginal vegetation. We also know that GCN require open water to facilitate courtship behaviour, so it's getting that mix of vegetation, aquatic vegetation, right. And as we said earlier, it is essential that ponds are placed where there is suitable terrestrial habitat. We know that GCN prefer ponds in clusters rather than single isolated ponds. One big issue for ponds over time, if there isn't management interventions, is shading on the southern aspect in particular, where trees grow up and shade a pond, and that pond then becomes less suitable for GCN. And I think probably we're all aware that we need to keep fish out of ponds where GCN are present, and the absence or low density of waterfowl, both for water quality issues, but potentially the introduction of fish eggs by birds. There is a much more detailed specification document that lies behind these headline kind of figures. Thank you, Annabelle.
Okay, thanks, Craig. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about increasing available terrestrial habitat for newts and why we're concentrating on ponds at the moment. So currently it appears that ponds are a limiting factor for newts in the landscape. As we discussed earlier on, there's been huge declines in ponds in the last 100 years or so. And therefore we're looking at getting ponds back into the landscape to help reverse this decline. Now, that's not to say this approach won't change in the future, and we'll start to look more at terrestrial habitat, but currently we're focusing on ponds. So great crested newts require both high quality ponds and high quality terrestrial habitat. One without the other is not suitable. So they need their ponds to breed in, but they also spend quite a significant amount of the year on land. So if you've got a pond and good terrestrial habitat, then that would be suitable habitat for newts. If you've got one without the other, then it's not suitable. So we're increasing our available terrestrial habitat to them by using our SOA maps. So the core SOAs, as Craig mentioned, have generally a higher density of existing ponds and appropriate terrestrial habitat. So by providing more ponds into the core SOAs, this enhances existing suitable habitat for great crested newts. So we're really looking at sort of consolidating existing populations in these areas. The fringe SOAs are slightly different. So they have a lower density of ponds, however they do have existing appropriate terrestrial habitat. So by providing more ponds in fringe areas, we are able to increase the available area of suitable habitat for great crested newts, and this is going to allow them to start to move back out into the landscape into areas where they're not currently present. So if we have a quick look at the picture on the right hand side of the slide, so this is a zoom in on an SOA map, and you can see the core areas in pink and the blue areas are fringe. And you can see that in the core areas, it looks like there's quite a few ponds there already. But as you move down to the bottom of the image, there's a general lack of ponds, and it's actually well over 500 metres away from those ponds as you get to the bottom of that image. However, the terrestrial habitat here still looks really good. You've got a good mosaic of woodland and grassland, which great crested newts like. So by putting ponds in that location in the bottom of the image there, it's very likely to increase the amount of available terrestrial habitat to newts if they were to colonise this pond. So while it's within a sort of colonisation dispersal distance from other ponds, it's not currently within an area which would be used as part of core habitat around an existing pond. Okay. We'll move on to discuss a little bit about the monitoring and management of our compensation ponds. This is really exciting because of the amount of data we're going to be able to generate under this approach. So while there's quite a lot of data out there about great crested newts at the moment, it's often not collected in a particularly standardised way, and this means that we can't do kind of large-scale national analysis on a lot of the data that is out there, and that will all change under this approach. So every compensation pond will receive eDNA and HSI surveys annually for the first 4 years. So we're really looking to understand how quickly they're being colonised and where great crested newts are and are not present. They'll also receive 3 rounds of further survey in years 18, 16 and 25, and this will be generally part as maintenance visits to understand what the condition of the ponds are at that time and whether newts are continuing to be present within these ponds. And there's funding within the conservation payment, which is made by a developer wishing to enter the scheme for contingency surveys. So if we need to survey, undertake additional surveys for any reason, then there's money to do that. And the ponds will also be being maintained and managed for 25 years. So the amount of management is going to vary pond by pond, but on average, there's money there for 3 rounds of maintenance visits and funding for maintenance actions, whatever that may need to be in relation to the individual ponds. So, for example, as Craig mentioned earlier, shading can become a bit of an issue in ponds, and if you need to remove some scrub and trees, then that would be one of the maintenance actions which would be funded. There'll also be population surveys carried out on a subsample of the compensation ponds, as well as existing ponds within the wide landscape. And this will allow us to compare population sizes within our compensation ponds and existing ponds within the landscape to understand what the trends are, whether our ponds are performing as well as or better than existing ponds. And the conservation payment made by developers wishing to enter the scheme also contributes to the GCN National Surveillance Programme, which is the PondNet initiative. And this will also develop more data for us to be able to compare our monitoring data against background trends. So we're really interested to understand how quickly these ponds are being colonised and what the colonisation rates are. So based on existing literature, we think we can expect around 16% to be colonised within the first year and up to 54% by the end of the second year. But obviously, as our data comes in, we're going to understand a lot more about these colonisation rates. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk a little bit about what's been delivered to date, and then in a moment Craig will be talking about our work this financial year. So to date, district licensing has delivered over 100 ponds. I think we're up to around 120 now. It's increasing all the time. Our habitat delivery bodies are out there as we speak, speaking to more landowners, getting more ponds in the ground. And we've got live Natural England-led district licensing schemes in Kent and Cheshire, and we'll have more launching elsewhere shortly. So I just wanted to pick up a little bit around the developments we've licensed to date under the district licensing schemes in Kent and Cheshire. So if we look at the number of ponds which are impacted within the site boundary, so the numbers which are actually present within a development red line boundary, of the schemes we've licensed to date, there have been no ponds present in red line boundaries. However, if we look at the number of ponds outside development boundaries and the proportional loss based on the impacts to terrestrial habitat, it's looking at about 2.83 ponds lost there. Obviously it's not a whole number because it's a proportional loss, and this includes both ponds which are and are not occupied by great crested newts. So we know that some of them are occupied, we know that some of them were not. And the compensation provided directly to deliver compensation for the above impacts is 8.14 compensation ponds. Obviously you can't deliver 0.14 of a pond, so it's actually 9 ponds. And so we've delivered the 9 ponds, and then there's also the equivalent number of contingency ponds as well. So you're looking at just over 16 ponds for an approximate impact to 2.83 ponds there. Okay. I'll pass you on to Craig, who's going to talk about more about our work this year.
Okay, thanks, Annabelle. So currently in this financial year, 2019-20, we're putting a whole slew of suitable ponds into the landscape ahead of launching. So that's the map on the right-hand side that you can see there. The dark green areas are Cheshire and Kent, where we've already gone live. And the coloured areas are where we're looking to roll out district licensing within the next 18 months or so. And we are putting in ponds, as many ponds as possible, pump priming, in effect, those areas with ponds in suitable SOA locations. And that's approximately 25 areas that are detailed in that slide. We have already mentioned about habitat delivery bodies. So it is not Natural England that are putting the ponds in the ground. It is what we call habitat delivery bodies. And we are working with LPAs in Kent, or subsidiaries thereof, and Cheshire, and also the Wildlife Trust, Countryside Management Partnerships in Kent, and a range soon of ecological consultancies and wildlife trusts to deliver ponds in all of the areas that we've detailed. We've just undertaken a tender exercise for about £1.3 million worth of pond delivery, with the balance of ponds being secured and administered through MOA agreements between Natural England and various LPA organisations across some of those targeted areas. So it's, in effect, it's all being done by habitat delivery bodies out with Natural England, working to the pond specification that we ran through earlier. And in effect, probably employing project officers to go out and engage with landowners. So the vast majority of habitat that we're looking at delivering here is in the wider landscape, often working with farmers as well as land either owned by the LPA or an NGO. Thanks, Annabelle. Okay. Do you want to talk through this one, Annabelle?
Yeah, sure. So just obviously thank you all for listening. We hope that's been a quick run through what the work we're doing around habitat delivery for the Natural England-led district licensing schemes. As you mentioned earlier on, there is one more webinar to go in this series, and it's how to apply if you're interested in doing so to enter the Natural England-led schemes, and that'll be on the 26th of November. And there are the 3 previous webinars also available if you're interested in learning more about it, and I can certainly recommend listening to those if you get a chance. Okay, shall we move on to the questions?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, thank you both very much. I will, before we go on to the Q&A, I'll just show you how to what webinars to record this webinar against, competencies, sorry. So you can record them again, you can record this webinar as structured CPD and use the following competencies. So environmental management, policy, legislation and standards, and facilitation, consultation, engagement and partnering. I'll also send that in the feedback survey later on this afternoon. So yes, we've had 13 questions come in already. So our first question is from Jonathan. As pond loss is a result of agriculture intensification, will pond creation be focused on nature reserves, SSIs and SACs?
Okay, I'll tackle that one. Thanks for the question. Well, clearly we know that loss of ponds has been mainly as a result of change of land use. That's correct. But development has obviously played a role within that urban development. So as I probably hinted at a few months ago, we're looking at putting ponds in a balance of habitats. Ostensibly, the most are going to be within that wider landscape area, so the farmed landscape. Looking at working, really, GCN is the epitome of a lot and species, a bigger, better joined up. So it's working with private landowners. Yes, some will be within reserves. We tend to avoid working on SACs, SPAs, unless there's a very good case to be made for putting ponds in there. But obviously, we are very mindful of the fact that we must protect other habitats and species as well. We shouldn't have a detrimental effect on those. So the majority are going within that farmed landscape.
That's great. Thank you, Craig. Another question from Guy. Could you clarify if we should be discussing with clients a risk of delay if the uptake of DLL outstripped the construction of ponds within the previous 12 months?
Okay, I can take this one. So obviously we're working really hard to get as many ponds in the ground up front as we can to make sure we've got a really good bank of ponds ready to use as compensation. We'd recommend you inquire about entering the scheme as early as you can if you're interested in doing so, and we'll let you know at that point what the availability of ponds is if you're interested in entering. And once you're, so we would issue you with a quote essentially based on your impacts, which would, and once that quote is signed, or it's a conservation payment certificate, once that certificate is signed, it secures those ponds for until you need them essentially. So you will know at the inquiry stage whether or not there is enough ponds in the ground to enter at that point. But we are, we're constantly getting more and more ponds in the ground and working really hard with the habitat delivery bodies to maximise the numbers there. So yeah, there is plenty of ponds there at the moment.
That's great, thank you, Annabelle. So another question from Jonathan. Can ongoing surveys by voluntary groups and consultants feed into the district level licensing?
Yeah, I can pick this one up again. So they certainly can. So the data is really, really key to our approach. It's incredibly important for our species distribution modelling, which maps the available suitable habitat for great crested newts. Obviously, the more data we've got, the more accurate these can become in time. So the modelling and the maps will be being updated periodically. So if you do have additional data, then obviously we can take that into account in the future.
That's great, thank you. Another question from Jonathan. What measures will be employed to mitigate the effect of barriers?
I'll take this one if I may. Certainly working overtime, Jonathan. Thanks for all these questions. We are, as we said earlier, obviously we're looking at creating ponds in SOAs, but that's only half the story because we are working through the habitat delivery bodies who are going out there and visiting each site. And it may well be that there are barriers to GCM present when they go on a site. So we provide each habitat delivery body staff what we call a pond checklist, which is a DCL document to be filled in during initial site visits. If that is favourable, subsequent visits when the capital works are done, and then a follow-up visit 3 months after the pond has been completed to check that water quality is good and that the pond has filled if it's a newly created pond. So it's through that checklist that we run through, and we're through a kind of like box ticking exercise. It runs through checking that there are no barriers present. If there are significant barriers present to GCN, then we wouldn't be putting a pond in that location, so it wouldn't be suitable. So we're not just reliant upon the modelling, we also have the human element for an extra check and balance at each stage.
That's great, thank you. Another question here from Helen. Whilst ponds are compensated and SOAs ensure connectivity, how are losses of terrestrial habitat compensated? For example, loss of a significant area of grassland, which may support significant numbers of foraging animals under favourable conditions.
Okay, I can pick this one up. So as we discussed earlier on, the proportion of terrestrial habitat loss associated with any site is calculated, and the impacts and compensation requirements are proportional to the loss of terrestrial habitat associated with the pond. And the approach at the moment is looking at increasing the availability of terrestrial habitat for newts. So by putting the ponds into fringe areas where there may be a lower density of ponds existing, and therefore newts are quite unlikely to be able to access a lot of this existing suitable terrestrial habitat, then we are increasing the availability of terrestrial habitat on that basis. We've done some initial assessments around this, and it's estimated that for every pond in fringe SOAs, we may be able to increase the availability of terrestrial habitat for great crested newts by up to 13.2 hectares.
That's great, thank you. Andrew asks, regarding aquatic vegetation, is natural colonisation preferred?
It is, yeah, absolutely. We're hoping to go to make ponds suitable through that natural processes. However, we are obviously, as Annabelle said earlier, monitoring ponds. Each pond will be monitored for the first 4 years, and we have modelled up what we believe colonisation rates should be. If that is not the case, then we would look at potentially seeding ponds. But at the moment, we're confident that shouldn't, certainly in the majority of cases, be needed. But we're not ruling that out in the future. And we'll use the monitoring results to dictate whether we go down that route.
Thank you. Another question here. How are ponds created that are only 100 metres squared realistically being managed? There is a small area that aquatic and marginal vegetation encroachment is inevitable.
I'll go on this one again. Yeah, so 100 metres square is obviously the very smallest sort of sized pond that we're looking at working with. We do have a minimum of 3 rounds of management interventions over the course of 25 years to ensure that pond remains A1 for GCN over the course of those 25 years. That's paid for up front by the developer. So it's a good point. Without intervention, those ponds would scrub over, shade over, and won't be suitable. But that money is paid for by the developer, and the work's undertaken by the habitat delivery body, allied to monitoring. So we're hopeful that we're keen for a habitat delivery body's project officer to engage with a landowner for a considerable time, so the landowner feels ownership of the project, familiarity with the staff involved, and it's through that monitoring and management process that interventions, when required, will be undertaken.
That's great, thank you, Craig. Michelle asks, where can we access the pond specification document, please?
I'm sure, Craig again, obviously, I'm sure we can make that available now. It's been signed off this week and has been shared with our habitat delivery bodies, secured under the tender. So that can be a public-facing document now, and we'll let people know where they can see that.
That's great, thank you. Andrew asks, when a pond or habitat is destroyed under district licensing, will any effort be made to rescue animals, or stipulate the work is done at a time of year when the animals are less likely to be occupying?
Okay, so any site which is licensed under district licensing, there is some best practice guidance associated with the license to encourage developers to undertake measures to minimise the risks to newts on site, and it is also possible to translocate newts up to 2 kilometres under these licences. However, the district licensing approach is really around maximising gains at a strategic scale. So looking to enhance habitat and increase populations across the landscape, and so we're not focusing so much on no net loss on sites anymore. We really want to be looking at gains in the wider landscape and hoping to maximise enhancement for newts on that basis.
That's great, thank you. A question from Jonathan. Can site-based mitigation schemes adopt the same approach as part of the ecological mitigation, of a site which is conserving great crested newts?
Okay, so obviously the district licensing scheme functions in a certain way, and if you're interested in using it, then we'd certainly recommend that you enter into the scheme. However, there are the DEFRA licensing policies which came out a few years ago, which have sort of allowed us to develop district licensing, if you like, and these can also be used on individual sites to look at doing things in a slightly different way. So yeah, you could certainly look at using those if you're interested in doing something slightly different on site.
Perfect, thank you. Are the SOA maps available to view online at all?
Some of them, yes. So we are still finalising a lot of them. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to finalise these. Certainly the Kent and Cheshire ones are available on our Natural England Open Data GeoPortal. You can view them and download them from there. And as well as the SOAs, there's also the risk zone maps as well, which look at where developments may or may not be more likely to impact on great crested newts.
Great, thank you. Deborah asks, how do you ascertain whether ponds are occupied or unoccupied? Do developers still need to survey their ponds?
I'll take this one if I may. It is entirely up to the developer whether they survey or not. So there's no requirement to survey. Equally, a developer may choose to survey. That depends upon season, various constraints, whether they're using ecologists to do other surveys, etc. If we are provided with survey data, then we simply go by the survey data provided, which will tell us X number of ponds occupied or unoccupied. If not, if no survey has been undertaken, then we use the data, the modelling data, and the zoning. So each area, landscape scale area, we zone. We have red zones, which can't enter district licensing because they contain either national or internationally important populations. We're taking a precautionary route for those. There are relatively few per area. And for those, the majority is either a orange zone or a green zone. And then we apply ratios 2 to 1, 1 to 1 accordingly in those areas. So we either go by modelling or we go by the data provided by the developer. And if it shows that a pond is occupied, then we'll be looking at 4 ponds for compensation ponds to be required for each one of the occupied ponds. So it's very much down to the developer.
That's great, thank you, Craig. Another question here, what's the difference between a compensation pond and a contingency pond? Okay,
I'm going to answer this one, and I'm also scanning ahead to the next question, which was Andrew's, about the agreement between Natural England and the landowner. So I'm going to cover those off in one, if I may.
Yes.
We decided quite early on not to go down a legal agreement route. Legal agreements could potentially put off a lot of landowners that might be amenable to the scheme, and obviously tie up considerable monies in the legal process. Instead, we wanted to mitigate risk by producing an extra pond. So for every pond that we need, we actually are going to produce 2. So what a landowner has to do is sign a landowner agreement, which is a letter stipulating that they're happy for ponds to be monitored for 25 years, that they agree for access to those ponds, and for access for management purposes, that they won't introduce wildfowl or put seed down to encourage wildfowl into the pond, nor will they put fish into the pond. That letter is not legally binding. It's something that is required before ponds are created on site, but it is not a legally binding document. We are mitigating risk by producing a contingency pond for every pond that we require. So if a developer has to has need to, say, produce 10 contingency ponds, we actually put 20 ponds in the ground. We double the habitat up front that is required, and that mitigates future losses. Clearly, some losses will occur because ponds fail initially, and then probably the greatest reason for loss will be changing landowner ownership over 25 years. Those are probably going to be the two big areas where we lose ponds. We're estimating loss to be in the region of 30 to 40%, but we're mitigating for 100% loss. So in effect, we're putting as many ponds in the ground as possible, as contingency, double what we require initially. And that clearly is best for the species. We know that GCN require ponds. We're buying as many ponds into the landscape as we can, rather than going down legal agreements.
That's great, thank you, Craig. Steve asks, will the SOA maps be added to Magic as a layer?
There's no plans to add them to Magic at the moment, but as we mentioned earlier, they are available on the open data geoportal if you want to download them and view them on there.
That's great, thank you. Deborah asks, what habitat dataset have you used to identify suitable terrestrial habitat? There are lots of errors in national datasets for our county. Have you worked with local environmental record centres to use local knowledge, such as existing county-wide phase 1 datasets?
Okay, so I think we've used the land cover map for habitat. And if you'd like to understand a little bit more about this, I'd certainly recommend listening to the modelling webinar, which will have covered that in quite a lot more detail. But we have obviously looked at the pros and cons of lots of different data sets. We've certainly discussed with local record centres where possible around using data, but it's the consistency of data which is really important under this approach to ensure that the models can function as they should and maximise their accuracy. And as we mentioned earlier, the models we've developed to date have all been 95% accurate at predicting presence of great crested newts based on all the available data we've got.
That's great, thank you, Annabelle. Joanne asks, if the ponds created are only monitored between 8, 16 and 25 years, how do you ensure that the ponds created are not damaged or lost during this time? And if so, are new ponds created to compensate for the lost compensation ponds?
I'll take that one. Loss in the majority of cases towards the end of the 25 years will be through changing land ownership, and there is an obligation for any landowner to let Natural England know if they're changing their ownership. So any potential change in that and the potential loss of ponds thereafter, there's an obligation for the landowner to tell Natural England. Clearly, if through those monitoring visits, 16 and 25 years, particularly the 8 and the 16, there is a need for a follow-up visit, then we do have contingency for extra visits within the conservation payment, which will then may precipitate action. And quite clearly, if ponds are being lost, then yes, we will count them as lost, and the contingency ponds will then be upgraded to be a compensation pond. So that's why we've always got a spare in our pocket, and it will be triggered at that point.
That's great, thank you, Craig. Andre asks, what proportion of the funds is spent on securing land, for example, paying farmers?
Okay, so there's a capital payment of £3,500 for a pond. That includes planning permission where required and a payment to the landowner. That payment's in the region of £600 to £700, and that's paid by the habitat delivery body to secure those ponds. Not all landowners have actually asked for that payment, interestingly, but it is there as an incentive. And it's the habitat delivery body negotiates with a landowner to that effect.
Thank you. Ian asks, will the location of created ponds be fed into Ordnance Survey or MAGIC, or will we need to use a different mechanism when doing desk studies?
So obviously, Ordnance Survey maps are updated periodically, and they will be picking up new ponds where available. We'll be directly feeding all our new ponds into our mapping, so our risk zone mapping and our SOA mapping. So yeah, as you're sort of looking at desk studies, if you're also using the risk zone maps, then they would be very up to date in terms of where risks are most likely to be for great crested newts.
That's great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. So how can you guarantee pond security over 25 years? How do you feed into and influence local plans, national infrastructure to avoid destruction of the SOA core and fringe areas? Okay,
I'll touch on this one again. Guarantee pond security? Obviously, that's not possible. We mitigate risk by the measures that I've discussed previously. Obviously, producing a spare pond, as it were, the contingency pond, and by having regular conversations and feedback with landowners. That really is important. That's why we've gone down the habitat delivery body approach, where a project officer visits the landowner regularly, and feeding back information from those monitoring visits back to the landowner is crucial. Getting the landowner feeling ownership of the pond and the whole ethos of the project will increase the security of ponds. How do we feed into local plans, national infrastructure, etc.? Well, clearly that is important, and working closely with the LPAs, that very much determines where SOAs go. So we take information from development plans and allocation data in determining where those SOAs are. So if there's a potential possibility that an SOA may be impinged upon by future development, it will be stripped out. So we are only looking at creating habitat where the short, certainly to medium term, there are no plans for development, and working hand in glove with LPAs to flag up where we are creating this habitat. And obviously, it's not in anybody's interest, a developer in the future or whomever, to actually put development in areas where there are SOAs, because they are GCN rich. So through the project, we're going to have far better knowledge of where GCNs are in the wider landscape and help determine where development happens in the future to avoid such areas. That's a key facet of the project.
Thank you. Richard asks, how much understanding of site hydrology is required and gathered before deciding on a location where water levels will be suitable?
I'll take that one again. Yeah, it's an important consideration. That's down to the habitat delivery body visiting a site. We are flagging up water quality issues, hydrology issues, and avoiding areas where there's significant runoff, etc. Alongside roads tend to be equally susceptible to potential pollution. And we're also insisting on significant terrestrial buffers around ponds, dependent upon the siting of those ponds. So if they're sited in areas of existing terrestrial habitat, suitable terrestrial habitat, then they only require a buffer of 3 meters. But if they're in other areas, then they will require buffers of around 10 meters around a pond, just to mitigate any potential runoff issues. But we are flagging up that there will be areas that might be otherwise suitable, where potentially farming activities, etc., will cause runoff, and those areas must be avoided. And that's something that we run through during a training exercise in advance of habitat delivery body starting work.
That's great, thank you. Drew asks, does the developer or client have to pay a fee to find out if ponds are available and the costs of district licensing?
So To understand what the costs to enter the scheme, we have to run quite a detailed impact assessment, and there is a fee associated with that. Off the top of my head, I think it's about £670 or there or thereabouts, but I'd need to double check on that. However, if there weren't any ponds available at that time, we would, I believe, waive that fee until the point when there was ponds available, should you wish to enter the scheme.
Thank you very much. Guy asks, having determined that it's legal to determine maintenance of the FCS tests through eDNA water sampling for the purpose of district level licensing, does this transfer over to traditional EPSM/LICL survey method? Are Natural England happy to accept water sampling, and are the days of using bottle traps over?
Okay, so district level licensing works quite differently to site-based licensing. So site-based licensing is looking at no detriment to favourable conservation status on a site level, and you will likely need quite a bit more information to inform that at the site level, and depending on what your impacts are, may or may not require population surveys. So it suggests that the situation is unchanged for now. In terms of district licensing, so we've undertaken a huge survey effort, have gathered all data from all sorts of areas, developed our species distribution modelling to give us an understanding of conservation status at the strategic scale, and this enables us to look at what the likely impacts would be at a strategic scale, and then also what likely impacts with compensation would be at the strategic scale to help us understand what the effectiveness of district licensing may be. So they work slightly differently, so it's unchanged for now for site-based mitigation licensing.
Thank you very much. What would be the situation if a new pond is made on private land and the land changes ownership?
Yeah, I kind of touched on this earlier. So we would have to be informed of a change in ownership, and then the habitat delivery body would make contact with a new landowner to see if they're still amenable to the project or not. If not, we would consider ponds to be lost.
Thank you. Who or what is a habitat delivery body? Are they vetted by Natural England?
Okay, I'll do it on again. Habitat delivery bodies, have probably covered this earlier, but the likes of wildlife trusts, ecological consultancies, LPAs, where they have an ecological arm, countryside management partnerships in Kent. Yes, maybe that is the wrong word, but we've just run a very large tender exercise to promote the project and seek habitat delivery bodies in areas of focus. And part of those criteria were capacity, experience, etc., etc. So there was an open and transparent process by which we determined the successful candidates. And it really was down to their experience of doing such work. Clearly, we are working with habitat delivery bodies that invariably all have done significant GCM mitigation work in the past. So it's not new to anybody, and have those experienced staff within house.
Thank you. Richard asks, are you taking the opportunity to monitor for other key species in the new ponds, for example, water voles?
So obviously we're primarily monitoring for great crested newts. That's what the scheme is all about, but there will be opportunities to collect other data as part of these monitoring visits. And certainly, obviously we know that, eDNA technology is advancing all the time, and what we can do with it is certainly increasing. So we've got all of our existing eDNA samples which were collected over the last few years, and we've got about 5,000 or 6,000 of those which were used to develop the baseline data for this approach. They are in a lab, and we're looking at what we might be able to do with those in terms of increasing available knowledge of what other species we use in those ponds that we sampled. And certainly we'd be able to think about using a similar approach for our monitoring going forward. So it's collecting data obviously while on site, but also looking at the potential of using the eDNA data that we're generating more widely as well.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I'm just aware that it's now 1:30 and we still have 18 questions left. Would you like to carry on for another 10 minutes?
I'm afraid I've got another call now, so I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid.
Okay.
More than happy to answer the questions at a later date and supply an answer.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, thank you very much, Craig. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Annabelle, shall we leave it there and pass on the questions, or would you like to answer a few more?
Hi, Chrissy. I'm happy to answer a couple more if there's a few more in the bank. But as Craig said, if there are any we don't get to, then we can certainly pick those up at a later date.
Okay, great. So there's one here from Ben Young. Is the 100-metre square minimum area set in stone? Just thinking of limestone dales with the size of dew ponds.
So we know that great crested newts generally like small to medium-sized ponds. We are ideally looking for 100 metres squared as a minimum, and even that is at the kind of lower end of what we're looking for. So where you're delivering the slightly smaller ponds, we'd be expecting them to be delivered in clusters to increase the availability of habitat overall. However, if there were local scenarios that needed to be thought about in a little more detail, obviously that would need to be done on a local basis. So every area where we're rolling out district licensing has its own strategy, which looks at all the local scenarios in a lot of detail, and it would be at that point when we might pick up on those types of conversations around pond size if needs be, and if there was justification for doing so.
That's great, thank you. Tatiana asks, is all habitat compensation equal, or is there a reduced demand of area that can be applied if providing wetland or difficult to establish habitat? Does the policy for survey requirement interact with this licensing pathway?
Okay, I think they are two questions there. So in relation to the first one, no, we have a standard approach on the district licensing. So all habitat compensation is considered on the same basis. So we are always expecting to achieve 4:1 ponds. We appreciate, it's going to be more difficult to establish them in some areas for various reasons, but we are still seeking to achieve that 4:1 compensation ratio as a minimum. And then in relation to the second question around survey requirement, so it is up to the consultant or the developer whether they choose to survey or not. It is possible to enter the scheme via a no survey approach, and we will then use our data and our modelling to inform what the impacts will be and what the compensation requirements are. The approaches, the survey and no survey approaches differ slightly, so it'd be good to familiarise yourself with those to help understand what may work best for you. Okay.
That's great, thank you. Amy asks, are the best practice guidelines you mentioned available online?
I don't think they are at present. So currently, if you're issued with a licence under district licensing, then they would be attached to that licence, so that they're issued at that point. And I'm not sure that they're available online at the moment, but we can certainly look into that.
Thank you. Guy asks, could you confirm if the no survey data approach assumes presence of GCN in the calculation?
So the no survey data approach is based on our species distribution modelling, which looks at where developments are most likely to impact great crested newts. So we've got our three zones, our red zone, our amber zone, and our green zone. Red zones are really important populations, and these sites are not eligible to enter district licensing. your amber zones are where we're predicting great crested newts to be present, and this is based on the species distribution model, so we'd expect 95% of populations to be within these amber zones, and your green zones are generally areas where we're not expecting newts to be present. So if you're entering via the no survey route and your site is within a amber zone, the compensation ratio for loss of ponds will always be 2. And the reason for this is the highest occupancy rate we've encountered anywhere nationally is in Essex, and it's just slightly under 50%, so it's around 48% presence in ponds there. And therefore, by using a compensation ratio of 2, you'll always be achieving your 4:1 on average.
That's great, thank you. Annabelle, are you able to see the list of questions? Are there any in particular that stand out that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I could cover the one from Rebecca on restoring ponds. So we're only restoring ponds which are currently completely unsuitable for great crested newts. So obviously restoring ponds is slightly more tricky in some respects than creating them. There's a lot more to consider. You need to consider other priority species and habitats and protected species to ensure you're not damaging or destroying those. And we'd need to be really confident that that you're not restoring a pond which is currently suitable for great crested newts. So we're only looking to restore ponds which will completely move from an unsuitable pond to a suitable pond.
Thank you. Question from Guy. Are the ponds constructed / cleared out on farmers' land for DLL are able to be included within the wider countryside stewardship schemes? I believe WN5 pays £270 per pond in mid and higher level schemes. Is this a driver for landowners?
Okay, so district licensing and the stewardship schemes are completely separate schemes, obviously, so they will work slightly differently, but and it would be worth considering certainly what stewardship options the landowner was under as to whether it would be appropriate to create or restore a pond within that option. So they are completely separate schemes, working in slightly different ways. So I think the payments are different on that basis.
Thank you. Is there any concern over loss of regular flow of new survey data outside of SOAs if landowners aren't required to survey impacted ponds?
Okay, so we will be obviously surveying our ponds, our compensation ponds, but we'll also be surveying a subset of other ponds within the wider landscape to look at existing data on existing ponds and what's going on in those ponds as well. So there will be quite a wide scale monitoring programme as part of district licensing, which will be looking at ponds in all sorts of scenarios. So we don't feel that there's going to be a reduced flow of data at present, and obviously there will still be survey data coming forward from development as well. A lot of developers are still choosing to survey to help inform their options under the scheme.
That's great, thank you. Andrew asks, as ponds will be monitored for GCN, will new ponds known to be occupied be therefore protected against damage or destruction? If so, will the landowner be made aware of this?
Yeah, so obviously if a pond becomes occupied by great crested newts, then the same legislation will apply. The habitat delivery bodies will be having a thorough conversation with the landowner when they're thinking about entering a scheme, and they would be made aware of these types of things. So we're looking generally at getting ponds into the wider landscape and in areas where are less risk of development in the long term. So for example, we're generally buffering urban areas out of the SOAs. So if you're looking at more development coming forward in the areas around existing urban centres in the future, they will be less likely to be impacting on the new ponds. But it will be a conversation between the habitat delivery body and the landowner up front to help them to understand what their responsibilities are essentially under the scheme, and what the implications would be if the pond were to be occupied by great crested newts.
Thank you very much. what's the approach to checking compensation ratio if the site is outside modelled areas or further to changed land use?
Okay, so we have been doing a little bit of monitoring around compensation ratios already. One of the reasons for this is to ensure that we're always meeting the minimum 4:1 ratio via both the survey and no survey routes. So we are continuing to monitor this and to look at what the ratios are overall. And this scheme is all about adaptive management as well. In time, if we feel we need to adjust something, then that will be adjusted to ensure that we're where we should be under the scheme.
Thank you. Another question, might river metric net gain offset be directed to the same benefit area?
Okay, so again, district licensing and net gain are completely different schemes, and they work in slightly different ways. However, there is opportunities for join up, not necessarily just with net gain, but with other schemes as well, to look at maximising benefits. So if you can get ponds into locations where there are other types of activities going on, which will result in multifunctional benefits. So, for example, nature recovery networks, getting ponds into those types of locations, or other strategic green infrastructure plans, then certainly there is a lot of potential for multifunctional benefits there.
Thank you. Are you happy to carry on with the last 4 questions?
Yeah, sure, that's no problem.
So Rebecca asks, how will the use and management of new ponds be controlled? Will the farmer have to sign up to a list of requirements and restrictions? What is it to stop the landowner using the pond for other uses, such as fishing or for intensive access for watering livestock?
Okay, so when a habitat delivery body an agreement from a landowner to enter the scheme, there is a list, if you like, of all the kind of do's and don'ts for great crested newt ponds, which include not introducing fish and not encouraging wildfowl and all those types of things, and ensuring that good quality water is maintained. So we do appreciate that there may be some unfortunate losses over the years if someone inadvertently or potentially intentionally introduces fish. However, those ponds would be replaced by the contingency ponds if need be. But the whole approach is really about developing a relationship between the habitat delivery body and the landowner. So they'll be visiting them over multiple years, and we hope that they'll be able to build up a really strong relationship with them and encourage the right sorts of land management essentially around these ponds.
That's great, thank you. The other question from Rebecca, I feel like we've answered that one already. What do you think?
Yes, I can just cover it off quickly. There's quite a detailed checklist associated with checking that sites are suitable for restoration or creation. And it's up to the habitat delivery bodies to make those informed decisions. So obviously we're not looking for any pond creation or restoration works to impact on existing high quality sites or priority habitats and species or other protected species and habitats. So there's a lot of site survey going on to ensure that doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. Drew asks, how do you predict the cost of monitoring in 25 years' time?
Okay, so obviously we understand what the cost of monitoring is currently. We know how much it costs to visit sites and to undertake eDNA surveys and other types of surveys. And we're also able to predict the change in costs through time via index linking the costs. And so we hope to have a fairly accurate picture of what the total costs are likely to be over a 25-year period, and that is paid for upfront by the developer.
Thank you. Final question. What are the benefits to the developer of undertaking a survey if they can enter the scheme without spending that money?
Okay, so it's all about understanding what their options are, I think. So if you don't know if you've got great crested newts on site, for example, then you may need to survey to establish that. So if you haven't got great crested newt present, then there would be no requirement to enter district licensing, for example. If you don't have high occupancy rates within ponds on the site, then there's an incentive to survey, because the compensation ratios are adjusted according to whether ponds are occupied or not. So the feedback we're generally getting at the moment is that developers are still choosing to survey where they can, where they've got time to do that, where where there are appropriate survey seasons, because it helps them to understand exactly what their options are up front. However, we do have the option to enter via the no survey route, and this gives developers the option to enter the scheme where there's not time to get surveys done, or where you're not in the appropriate season, for example.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Annabelle. I think that concludes the Q&A session. Thank you to everybody for joining and for staying with us. We will be sending out a feedback survey this afternoon, so please do fill that in as it helps to inform our future webinars. We'll also share the links from the previous district level licensing webinars as well. So yes, thank you again, Annabelle. And thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you join us at the next CIEEM webinar.
Great, thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks very much, bye-bye.
Bye.